We are absolutely drowning in data. I mean, every single day, you see headlines making these huge claims based on statistics, right? Do more of this, you'll get that result. Do less of this, you'll prevent something else. But with this absolute explosion of information, are we actually getting the story right? Are we looking at a real cause and effect relationship, or are we just seeing a coincidence? For decades, pretty much all of scientific research was ruled by one little number, the p-value. If you could get a p-value less than 0.05, that was your golden ticket. You got published. But as the statistician George Cobb pointed out, this created this kind of bizarre circular logic. We teach it because it's what we do it because it's what we teach. And this obsession has led to what's now called a reproducibility crisis in science, where findings that we thought were rock solid, well, they just can't be repeated. So that's the big question, isn't it? How do we break this cycle? How do we get smarter about our data so we can see the real causal story that's hiding in the numbers, instead of just chasing some arbitrary cutoff for significance? Well, it turns out the answer might not start with a complex formula, but with a simple drawing. So here's our game plan for this explainer. First, we're going to pull back the curtain on the significance illusion. Then we'll get hands-on with a new technique, drawing your assumptions. After that, we'll dive into the 3 basic paths that connect all data, see how we can accidentally sabotage our own work, and finally wrap it all up by showing how this leads to much, much smarter modeling. Okay, let's jump right into that significance illusion. The whole problem with a single bright line rule like p is less than 0.05 is that it just completely distorts the scientific process. It tries to squish a complex, messy reality into a simple yes or no answer, and frankly, that leads to some really bad decisions. The American Statistical Association actually had to step in and lay out some ground rules to clear this all up. First, and this is a big one, a p-value is not the probability that your theory is correct. It's really just a statement about how surprising your data is if you assume there's no effect. Second, it tells you nothing about how big or important an effect is. You can have a teeny tiny, totally meaningless effect with a super small p-value as long as you have enough data. And finally, this all led to p-hacking, where researchers just keep torturing the data until it confesses and gives them that magic number, which makes the results totally uninterpretable. All right, so if the p-value isn't our North Star, then what is? Well, this is where a really powerful, and I mean surprisingly simple, visual tool comes into play. It's called a directed acyclic graph, or a DAG for short. And what it does is it forces us to be crystal clear about our assumptions about the world before we even think about touching the numbers. Think of a DAG as a blueprint of your theory. It's a map of what you believe is causing what. Every variable is a node, just a circle with a name in it, and every arrow you draw represents a direct causal link. You draw an arrow from X to Y if you believe X causes Y. They're called acyclic because, well, you can't have a variable that loops back and causes itself. That would make sense. And the best part? It has nothing to do with fancy math. It's all about the logical structure of your argument. Now, here's where it gets really elegant. Once you start drawing these maps, you begin to realize something amazing. Any possible connection between any 2 variables can be broken down into just 3 fundamental structures. If you can understand these 3 simple paths, you basically understand the building blocks of all causal thinking. So, what are these 3 building blocks? They are chains, which explain how one thing leads to another through a mediator. Then you have forks, which are the classic picture of confounding. And finally, the most interesting and counterintuitive one, inverted forks, which create something we call a collider. Let's break each one down. First up, we have the chain. This is the most direct and intuitive causal path. It's like a row of dominoes. Variable A causes B, which then causes C. A perfect real-world example is smoking leads to higher cholesterol, which in turn increases the risk of cardiac arrest. Cholesterol here is the mediator. It's the mechanism, the how, through which smoking has its dangerous effect. Next, we have the fork. Now, this is the classic structure of what we call confounding. It's where a single common cause, let's call it A, affects 2 other things, B and C. This makes it look like B and C are related, even if they have no direct causal link. For instance, a viral infection can cause a child to wheeze. A viral infection can also lead parents to give their child paracetamol. If you don't account for that infection, you might wrongly conclude that the paracetamol is causing the wheezing. The infection is the confounder, the hidden common cause. I absolutely love this quote because it captures the idea perfectly. Think of that confounding path as an open pipe, just letting bias flow right into your analysis. So to figure out the true effect, you have to block that pipe. And in statistics, blocking the pipe just means adjusting for or conditioning on that common cause. Okay, now this slide sets up the third and honestly most mind-bending path of all. With a fork, a confounder, we have a common cause, and we adjust for it to get rid of bias. But with an inverted fork, we have a common effect. And here is the twist. Adjusting for that common effect does the exact opposite. It creates bias out of thin air. And that brings us to the inverted fork. This is what happens when two totally separate, independent causes lead to a single common effect. That point where the two arrows meet and crash into each other, that's called a collider. So for example, both influenza and chickenpox can cause a fever. Now, in the general population, getting the flu has absolutely nothing to do with getting chickenpox. They are unrelated. But here's the million-dollar question. What happens if we're doing a study and we decide our sample will only be made up of people who currently have a fever? By making that choice, we have just conditioned on the collider. And boom! Here's the big reveal. By focusing only on people with a fever, we have just kicked open a backdoor path that was naturally blocked. I mean, think it through. You're a doctor and you see a patient with a fever. You run a test and find out they don't have the flu. What's your next thought? Well, it suddenly becomes much more likely they have chickenpox. In your sample of feverish patients, you've just created a fake negative association between two totally unrelated diseases. This is called collider bias, and it is a massive and super common form of selection bias. So you can see why understanding these paths is so incredibly important. This isn't just some abstract academic exercise. If you don't get this right, you can end up hiding a real effect that's there, or even worse, inventing a fake one that isn't. You can literally sabotage your own statistics. Let's look at two of the most common ways this goes wrong. First is the overadjustment trap. This is when you adjust for a mediator that's part of your causal chain. You accidentally block the very road you're trying to measure, and poof, the true effect disappears. Then there's the selection bias trap we just talked about, adjusting for a collider which opens up a backdoor and creates a false effect. Here's a real-world example of overadjustment. In pediatric research, we know that antenatal steroids help reduce the severity of a newborn's disease, which in turn lowers their risk of a lung condition called BPD. But some early studies statistically adjusted their analysis for the severity of the disease. By controlling for that mediator, the very mechanism they were studying, they blocked the causal path and made it look like the steroids did nothing at all. And for selection bias, here's a classic case. Some early studies found a link between a specific gene variant, HLA-A2, and the risk of developing a type of leukemia, ALL. But they made a fatal mistake. Their study group was composed of existing patients, survivors. It turned out the gene didn't make you more likely to get the disease, it made you more likely to survive it. By only looking at survivors, they had conditioned on a collider and created a completely false link between the gene and the disease itself. Okay, so let's bring this all home. How does this new way of thinking translate into what we actually do? Well, this whole idea of drawing your assumptions first completely changes how you should approach building a statistical model. It's about being thoughtful and deliberate, not just chucking every variable you have into a meat grinder and hoping a sausage comes out. And this is exactly why automated methods like stepwise variable selection are so dangerous. The algorithm doesn't understand cause and effect. It has no idea what a confounder, a mediator, or a collider is. It just mindlessly hunts for the smallest p-values, which leads to models that are biased, wildly overconfident, and very often just plain wrong. As one paper so brilliantly put it, its main appeal is that it allows us not to think about the problem. And get this causal thinking even changes how we should deal with something as basic as missing data. The old school method of just deleting any person from your dataset if they have a single missing value can be a total disaster. You have to ask, why is the data missing? If the reason it's missing is related to both the thing you're studying and your outcome, you may have just introduced collider bias. That's why modern methods like multiple imputation are so much better. They try to account for that uncertainty instead of just ignoring it. And that really brings us to the final, most important point. For decades, we've all been trained to ask one question: is this p-value significant? But this entire framework gives us a much more profound, much more powerful question to ask first. Have I drawn my assumptions? By forcing ourselves to build a visual map of what we believe to be true about the world before we run a single number, we move from just blindly following rules to engaging in real, honest scientific reasoning. And that is how we start to get causation right.